Today I'm going to show you how I made the artwork for our radio charting new single, Say What You Will.
So you said me or nothing at all.
What's up everybody? Sam here from Reclaimers. We are super excited that our brand new single, Say What You Will, hit number 15 on the CMW Rock Radio chart this week and was number 1 most added on that chart, as well as being number 1 in the Power Surge section of that radio chart. So big thanks to everyone who's been involved in that. Thank God, thank the Del Sestos, our radio promoters, and all the fans and radio stations that have been a part of that. Today I wanted to show you how I made this artwork. Talk a little bit about the concept of the artwork before we get into the technical stuff. The concept here is that you have this guy who, seemingly it's almost like the world may even be ending. And what is he going to focus on? There's this beautiful sunset in front of him, but there's also these impending, meteors falling toward the Earth or whatever planet that he's on. And that's really what this song is about. Who and what is your focus on? Whose words mean the most to you? Is it what everybody else is saying, what's going on in the world, or is it God's words? And our focus can be very, very important. And that was a theme in the lyrics, and I wanted it to be a theme in the artwork too. The technique that I used here is called compositing. That can be kind of tricky because all of the images that you pull together to make a new composite usually have different color balance, are shot from different perspectives. How can you use some visual know-how and some tricks to really make them stick? So I wanted to start out by showing you some of the images that I used. This is probably my favorite piece. This, I believe, is a glob of paint dropped in like a bucket of oil. And this is actually what ended up becoming our planet here, or this moon that's orbiting so close to our observer's position. Here's an image that I pulled some of these comets from, and before you ask, all of these images were used appropriately and legally. This sort of nebula over this looks like an old church image. Here's where we pulled our observer from, our guy standing at the top of the mountain on the precipice watching all this going on. And then just some sky stuff that we used in the very, very end of the compositing process. So let's go over here to Affinity Photo. Let's knock this back to the very first layer here. And you can see it's just that nebula image. And it's framed kind of out of frame because I just wanted that chunk of the sky. We're going to fill in the rest of the sky with this next layer up. And that's our beautiful sunset. Now this is really cool. There's complementary colors going on here. You've got the orange completely complementing the purple and the cyan, but at the same time, it's pretty apparent that these are two separate photos that are being squashed together, especially if you look down here at the bottom. I'm gonna pop our planet in here, and this is that paint glob we talked about earlier. And some basic things have been done to it, kind of shifting the hue and the saturation to make the colors look a little bit more natural and a little bit more drab because it's off in the atmosphere, right? As well as adding this shadow effect to it. If we go back and we look here at the paint blob, this is very evenly lit. There's no shadow here, so it's harder to convince you that this is a globe, a spherical thing. So one of the first steps I took here was to add this shadow to make it look as if, this sunset happening off in the distance is also casting some light on this, nearby moon or nearby planet. I'm gonna go ahead and add our observer. Now this was kind of tricky because he was his own photo, right? So that's where the composition started to kind of tell me what it needed. I'm like, okay, so maybe this guy, we keep this part of the cliff here and he's standing up on a cliff, and this purple part we're just gonna use for the sky. But you notice he's not fully opaque. I had to do this in a few different layers. So next, we kind of shore him up. He gets darker, he gets more opaque, and now the ground is starting to take a little bit more shape. And because of some stuff I had to do, you notice there's a problem with the opacity up here in the top of his head. So we had to fix that with this layer where I just painted it in by hand with like a black paintbrush here. Just kind of paint that in. So now the general composition is starting to take shape. And another thing you'll notice that I did was I actually masked out our guy. I went in here, created a mask, and brushed all along as precisely as I could on the edges of his silhouette so that I could have that and then apply it to other layers if I needed to too, if I was creating an effect that I wanted to apply in everything else in the picture except for him or vice versa. If I undo this mask, you can see there's all the clouds and all the other stuff from the original photograph that he was in, and I had to get rid of that. Going up a layer up on top of that, we're going to do a little bit more to the planet, and you can see I'm kind of working back and forth between different aspects of the composition. It's so easy, and this happens to me when I'm mixing music too, to get hung up on one specific thing, but it helps me be more efficient with my workflows and almost whatever I'm doing to rotate. If we look at what I've done here, I've made this planet more kind of blood red, and I've added, there's definitely a more pronounced rim light along this outer side here. And I also did some texturing. You notice originally, that's just the paint blob. So I used some filters and effects to give a little bit of texture so that it looks more like the surface of a planet that has topography and that has geography of its own. And then this rim light again helps to convince us that this planet is closer to us than the sun. That is, you know, a star off in the distance that's setting. So it's being backlit by this sun. And it also just kind of adds to the drama as well. A couple of layers of like nebula and stars that I have set to an overlay blend mode. And blend modes are huge in my workflow. You know, if this was normal, well, that's too much. We really just want the stars to kind of poke through and look like space dust. So I ended up using an overlay and then also masking out corners of the image just to kind of get it, because this is what happens if I don't mask it. It takes over everything. I just wanted it to pop up in the middle, and we're using that to help blend between those original two sky canvases that we started with. Now we go to our comets, and this was this is really interesting. Well, they're meteorites. They're not even comets, right? They're supposed to be meteorites. They're entering the atmosphere. The outer shell of them is burning up in the atmosphere, but they're getting dangerously close. A few things that we had to do here. First of all, they had to be masked out, because this is the original picture that they're in. I had to flip it and rotate the whole thing sideways, and you can see the edge of it here. So I had to go in with my drawing tablet with a soft edged brush and really, really carefully extract these comets just enough that I got them, and I shifted the hue, because originally they were blue, shifted it to this orangish color, because again, they're entering the atmosphere. They would be giving off that warm tone glow. And then finally a curves adjustment. If we take a look what I did to these curves, I really darkened the area around them so that the only part that really came through of these comets was the highlights, was the part that I wanted, not the sky around them. And that helped compound the blending layer, or I'm sorry, the blending mode of this whole layer, which is light. If I go to normal, you can see it's actually not the most clean cutout you could do. It's a little bit dirty. When you move that over to the lighten mode, you really only get the highlights, which is all we wanted. Now we're going to get to the top few layers, which were some adjustments that I made to make all of these constituent pieces really stick together. So if everything that we have done up until this point, to use an audio metaphor, was mixing, now we're on to the mastering stuff, the stuff that happens right along the top to really help all these things stick together with a final glue. First thing I realized was that while I really loved that I added all of this texture to the planet, it's behind the atmosphere, right? If this guy's on Earth, then the atmosphere of the Earth would be occluding or getting in the way of that planet, and it would be a little bit blurred out. So I went and I looked at images from sci-fi movies where like a giant ship is right above the atmosphere. And one of the things that happens is, because the camera is supposed to be focused on this guy, even if it's got a really small aperture, f-stops of like 6 to 10 to 15, that planet there is still pretty much going to be out of focus, out of the camera's focus range. So we did some Gaussian blur. We just lightly blur that planet to make it look farther away. It's a subtle effect. I didn't want to overdo it. Then also on the planet, I applied some split toning. And you'll notice that on many of these layers where I just want to affect the planet with a adjustment layer, there's also a mask with a circle cut out, just so that the only thing I'm adjusting is that planet and not the whole composition, not the entire canvas. So this split toning is really, really subtle, and if you notice, all it does to this planet is add just a little bit of warm hues and tones here, just to kind of convince you of the effect that this planet is catching some light from the sun setting off in the distance. Is this the way that the colors would actually interact in space? Maybe not, probably not, but it helped it look more convincing to my eye. And, you know, this is artwork for a single, so it can be a little hyped up and a little surreal if we want it to be, and that's perfectly okay. Another hue saturation adjustment. So all that stuff I did, hyping up the planet, I left that down there, but then I brought the saturation of it back down, because things that are off outside of the atmosphere of the Earth look a little bit desaturated because there's all these air and water particles getting in the way of them. So I did all this work, and then I sort of covered it up by bringing the saturation down a little bit to help it look like it's off in the distance appropriately. Two more things here. Last thing was this sort of sky overlay. I realized that aside from maybe desaturating that planet, there was nothing here that actually gave you the atmosphere of the Earth. And even if it's a really, really clear evening, there's still at least some minimal cloud cover. And if there's any of that at all, then the sun peeking out over the horizon with that nice warm light is going to be reflecting off the bottom of the clouds. So I took that sunset picture of the clouds I showed you at the beginning, and I just ever so lightly laid it in here. It's a blend mode of add, so we're really just mostly catching the highlights. And I brought the opacity down to 48%. This is great. It helps everything stick together a little bit better. It looks like there's some atmosphere now. But the problem that it presents is it sort of washed out my image. I lost all of that nice, juicy, dramatic contrast I had just a moment ago. So we added that in, and then the finishing touch to then push it back to the finish line was this curves adjustment. So if we take a look here, I squeezed my shadows back down and made them dark again, and I hyped up my highlights a little bit more again, because this is an album cover, or it's a single cover. It's supposed to be eye-popping. It's supposed to get your attention. So a high contrast image is one of the ways that we can do that. Okay, so that's a really, really fast explainer. If you're an art nerd like me, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Again, if you haven't already, like and subscribe and follow Reclaimers on all sorts of social media, and add our brand new single, Say What You Will, to your playlist or list of downloads. Check out the links in the description. I love you, Jesus loves you, and as I say over on the Samuel Day channel, until next time, onward and upward.